So I think we're a couple minutes after, so most people should be here by now. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We are so excited to have you here. We are, of course, covering soil tonight. We're going to have a great presentation, but I have a few details to let you know about Zoom just before we get started. One is if you have not done a full screen view, that's probably the best way to see the slides. The other thing is we'd like you to check on, there's a little view box, or there should be a view box towards the top of where you can see the talking heads, the little boxes. In that, you'll find something called hide thumbnail view, a thumbnail video, and that will help you really maximize your screen. You won't see our speakers, but you will get to see the whole screen. So I wanted to encourage everyone to use that format. The other thing I'd like to note, if you haven't done one of our programs before, we generally audio and video mute everyone, and then we ask you to type your questions into our chat box. The chat box you can find usually at the top or the bottom of your screen. It should be a small icon that actually says chat. And if you click on that, you can type in questions. You can type in questions just to the hosts, but also to the whole group, and that's preferable. And then we will try to answer those questions as we go along through the chat. And certainly we will have time at the end to do a little bit of Q&A. So please do type your questions in there. And I'm going to turn it over now to our host, the Napa County Library, and Stephanie Premick. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Yvonne. I'm delighted the library is in partnership with the UC Master Gardeners of Napa County to bring you these programs. Whether it's learning how to develop a rich soil for your garden or how to prune your fruit trees, the UC Master Gardeners are there to support the community with practical and science-based information. So thank you for being here tonight. I'm looking forward to tonight's program. It's on to you, Yvonne.
Okay, well, I'm going to do one more thing before we get started, and that is, I know we have some people coming in from other counties besides Napa County in California, and some people from out of state as well. So if you would please, in the chat box, type in where you're coming to us from, where's your home, and also if your internet connection is listing you as just a number or an iPad number or something like that, if you would just put in your first name so that when we see your chat questions, you can rename yourself and just type in your first name. And now I'm going to turn it over to Lori. So go ahead, Lori.
Good evening. It's so wonderful to have you all here tonight. My name is Lori Budash, and I'd like to welcome you to the UC Master Gardeners of Napa County's presentation of Soil is the Solution, Healing the Earth 1 Yard at a Time. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about the UC Master Gardener program. We are a volunteer organization affiliated with the University of California. Our mission is to provide research-based, science-based information to the home gardener. We give presentations, we host public workshops, we staff a help desk for call-in or drop-in garden questions at our office in Napa. And we also train future master gardeners. So we would love to have you join us if you're interested in our program. Next slide, please. I'm here tonight with Carol Glazer, another master gardener, for this presentation. Our fellow master gardener, Matt Navarro, will be collecting your questions in the chat. And as Yvonne mentioned, we will be addressing those at the end of the program. So please go ahead and put your comments and questions in there throughout the evening. As master gardeners, our goal with this presentation is to help establish Napa County as a place that values and implements regenerative gardening practices. Next slide, please. So I want to start off with a poll. Did you know there is a relationship between soil health and climate change? So Yvonne, let's show them the poll, and you can go ahead and type in yes or no, or you'll see the questions here.
Everybody's voting really well here. We're getting 85%. Another
good.
couple seconds. Okay.
All right.
Got your votes in. I'm going to end the poll now and show you the results.
Hey, that's great. So you know why you're here tonight. You're hearing all the good stuff that supports what you already know. Okay, Yvonne, that's our poll results.
Okay.
We can move on to the first, well, we can hold on to that. Tonight, we're going to share, we're going to share information about why soil all around the world is in trouble and how the role of the soil is critical in helping us mitigate the ongoing effects of climate change. We will give you tips on what you can do to create healthy soil in your own gardens at home, and which will also help draw down one of the major greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, and we want to keep it there down in the soil. Climate change is a reality and is a result of the negative impact we, primarily the industrialized countries, have had on the natural systems of the earth. Our planet has been sending us messages for decades, and we are out of balance with nature, and we can no longer ignore these warnings. The three big greenhouse gases are carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. Carbon dioxide, being one of the worst, is because it can remain in the atmosphere for 300 to 1,000 years. So this isn't something that we want out there. Next slide, please. Scientists, engineers, academics and others are exploring and implementing approaches to address climate change. But there is one solution that is natural, inexpensive, and can be implemented immediately by all of us. And it's right under our feet. I'm showing here a few of the people that we've pulled, the organizations that we pulled some incredibly valuable information from. So these are going to be in our reference at the end, and you might want to research them more yourself too. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry, one more thing. The Rodale Institute in Pennsylvania is one of the global leaders in regenerative organic agriculture, along with many researchers and universities around the world. Rodale recently released an analysis on the potential of soil carbon sequestration and concluded that a global switch to regenerative crop and pasture systems could draw down more than 100% of the world's annual carbon dioxide emissions. So we need to look at to see how this is possible. Let's start with an overview of the ecosystems that help our planet function. Next slide. The global carbon cycle. This slide shows us the process in which carbon atoms naturally circulate from the atmosphere down into our soil and oceans, then back into the atmosphere again. Since our planet and its atmosphere form a closed system, the amount of carbon in this system does not change. You can see here how the plants, particularly the forests and the trees, oceans, and soil are the planet's carbon sinks, the repositories for holding the carbon out of the atmosphere. Soil is the second largest carbon sink after our oceans, and it can lock up carbon for thousands of years. Plants are the third largest sequester of carbon. But unfortunately, we've increased the release of carbon dioxide levels in our atmosphere by 33% in just the past 70 years, while greatly reducing the capability of our soils and oceans to sequester it. Our agricultural practices and the burning of fossil fuels to heat our buildings and run our cars are the primary causes of the excess. These practices, combined with the habitat loss of grasslands and forests that would naturally sequester this carbon, have created an imbalance in the system. But carbon is not the enemy. How we work the soil as farmers and home gardeners can make a considerable difference to our climate change problem. And one of the greatest ways is to regenerate our soil. And that's what we want to share with you tonight, how to do that. Let's take a look at how the plants work first, though. Next slide. Okay, I'm taking you back to school now. Photosynthesis. Growing healthy soil starts with a biological process of the plants. Green plants absorb three elements from the atmosphere. They absorb carbon dioxide molecules, they absorb light energy from the sun, and water. And then once those things enter the plant, there are special plant cells that chemical reactions combine these elements and turn them into an energy-rich glucose, which is also what we call sugars, and oxygen gas molecules are formed. The glucose is stored inside the plant, and the oxygen, trouble with that word tonight, is released into the atmosphere. Thank goodness, or we wouldn't be able to breathe here. About half of these sugars move down into the roots of the plant to feed the soil microbes that are in turn nourishing the plant with minerals from the soil. It's a collaborative exchange, and you can see how critical carbon is to this process. It feeds the plant and the living creatures in the soil. Next slide, please. Microbiologist Dr. David Johnson says, soil is a living organism and you have to feed this organism. That means you have to have crops growing continually, either a commodity crop or a cover crop. Crops shuttle the energy from a photosynthesis down to the soil system as sugars, proteins, and amino acids, which allow these organisms to survive. Next. So let's take a look at a very natural system. Look at this picture of the forest and think about, what do you notice in this picture? I'm going to tell you what we see. As leaves fall and combine with old leaf litter and other decaying materials on the ground, a natural compost is formed that will filter down into the soil to increase the essential organic matter there. The ground is covered by its own natural mulch. There's a diversity of plants, trees, and shrubs, and the soil here is not being disturbed by humans compacting it by walking on it or tilling it. Let us put these systems of nature that have run for thousands of years into practice in our own gardens, and we can do that so that we will work like a forest does. A healthy natural system sequesters carbon and regenerates the soil without human interference. Next slide. Here's a picture of what's going on underground. In just 1 teaspoon of healthy soil, there are billions of living organisms. Soil life is exceptionally complex, as you can see here. Excuse me, it's comprised of a vast community of microscopic bacteria, fungi, protozoa, and nematodes, as well as earthworms, spiders, and insects. Even vertebrates play their part in the soil. Underground, the soil community builds carbon stores through its interactions with the soil structure of living roots and decomposed organic matter. While above ground, we have the plants, the animals, the weather, people, and farming practices all affecting the soil. So we need to find a balance between the two, above and under the ground. Next slide, please. Now, this might get a little bit scientific here, but it's a good word to understand, rhizosphere. And the rhizosphere is critical in feeding those roots. Understand that the roots of plants, they take and they give back continually underground. Rhizosphere is a narrow region of soil around those roots in which the chemistry and the microbiology occurs to feed the plant and to feed the soil. In just the past 25 years, we've learned that the majority of soil is built from the sugars the plants pump into the ground. These water-soluble compounds of sugars, amino acids, and organic acids feed the microorganisms in the soil around it. And those microorganisms, in return, they provide nutrients to the plant. It's a dynamic, interdependent system necessary to grow healthy plants. Next slide. So we're going to give you 8 tips tonight that we're going to share and that will help you grow healthy soil and plants in your garden, while at the same time you can help everyone fight against climate change by sequestering carbon deep into your soil. So these 8 points, I'm not going to read these out loud, but you're going to see them as we bring them up. Okay, let's go to the first tip, which is increasing soil organic matter. Next slide. Okay, look at the pie chart on the left. Soil is made up of 4 main components. There are porous parts such as air and water, and there are solid parts such as the minerals, sand, silt, and clay. And then there's this little slice of 5% or less of soil organic matter. Now, first, why is air important in the soil? Well, air aids roots in penetrating the soil. It provides passages for the water to move down and to be retained in the soil. It supplies oxygen to soil organisms, which in turn supplies nutrients to the plants. And it provides space and a place where nitrogen can exchange into organisms. And without air, roots and organisms would die. Now, I don't need to talk about water because we all know water is essential to life on this earth. So we're going to talk now about sand, silt, and clay. These 3 minerals, they form the sandy loam soil, which is ideal for growing plants with its rich mixture of organic matter for proper water retention, porosity in the soil, for the air, and the space for plant roots to grow down through it. It's made of approximately equal parts of sand, silt, and clay. Now, let's talk about what is soil organic matter. This is a critical piece of the soil. This is only 5% or less of the soil, and it's made up of plant or animal material at different stages of decomposition. Soil organic matter is a living biomass of microbes, fresh and partially decomposed organic matter and humus. It supplies nutrients and food for organism and microbial diversity. Now, unfortunately, most of the agricultural lands that have been farmed conventionally, especially during our industrialized times since the 50s, hold only about 1% of organic matter. By increasing that soil organic matter, soil health is typically improved since this matter affects critical soil functions. Farmers who are farming in regenerative ways are finding that they are able to build back that organic matter in their soil up to 4 to 5% more, because presently they have depleted it so much that we have very little of it left in there in the big farms. Next slide, please. So let's take a poll. Do you use compost on a regular basis in your garden? So please answer this poll in coming up. Have you used compost in your garden? Yes or no? We have a very educated group here. Look at this. Okay. Yvonne, the results?
I was sharing them. Are they not showing?
They are. It looks like 87% of the people have used compost and only 13% have not. So listen, 13%ers, we're going to get you using it before we're done tonight. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, adding compost. Now look on the left side here. Adding compost to your gardens helps build that essential soil organic matter, that less than 5%. And if you really get hooked, you can make your own. So this gardener here is making their own with the ingredients on the left, a lot of leftover food waste that they're, left over from dinners, and mixing it with other materials, brown materials like leaves, green materials like grass clippings, straw, all kinds of good organic stuff. And that is going to turn into that beautiful, rich compost that's shown on the right. Your soil is going to love that stuff. For those of you with lawns, when you mow your grass, keep it high, at least 3 inches long, to keep soil underneath it cool and retain the moisture in it. But leave those grass clippings on the surface. And over time, they will work their way down into the soil and actually feed and become like a compost itself down under your grass into the roots. Rake your fallen leaves into your garden beds because they will help also create compost naturally and will keep your ground covered without you spending a dime. So you don't have to buy the compost, you can make it, or you can buy it. Let that organic matter in your soil attract and nurture the soil organisms and do much of the work for you. Even one application of compost persists in the soil to increase increase carbon levels. And so you want to do this at least once a year. And sometimes in between, you want to put a little bit more on as you are depleting that soil from growing veggies and those kinds of things. Let's go to the next slide. This is our next tip, is to keep your soil covered. This is so important, especially here in California. Next slide. And I say that because California, with our weather extremes, can really be hard on a soil. So we encourage everyone to plant cover crops. It's called the green mulch or the green manure, wherever you have bare ground and unplanted vegetable beds, put in cover crops. They will protect your soil from weather and exposure while they improve soil tilth, attract the soil organisms, they'll add to the soil matter, and they'll increase the fertility and retain moisture in the ground. The crops will keep the soil organisms fed, happy and abundant, and they'll prevent leaching of the soil minerals. It's a great way to build healthy soil. Healthy fertility of the soil with added biomass, both above and below the ground. And if the cover crop has legumes in it, such as peas and beans, you will also be naturally fixing nitrogen into your soil for the plants that follow that you plant next in that garden. Cover crops, along with compost, will hold carbon in the soil and create a richer biodiversity for growing more crops. So you may be asking, well, what cover crops should I plant? And we recommend a blend of seeds. You can do a combination of things like vetch, fava beans, daikon radish that sends its roots really deep into the ground to create those water and air passages. Ryegrass, mustards, there's multiple varieties of clover to use and many more. Broadcast the seeds fairly densely so that they will naturally suppress weeds. Isn't that a good sign? You don't have to be pulling all those weeds. And farmers and scientists alike are encouraging that you use a blend of 12 to 20 different types of seeds. Did we lose our presentation there? There. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. All right, here are some beautiful cover crops. So if you're worried about it all just looking like a variety of green, you can also do this wonderful red crimson clover. You can do white clover. In the center is buckwheat that has a beautiful white flower. And on the right, you can see a whole variety of cover crops. Now, here's the thing. When should you plant the cover crops? Now that's going to be different depending on where you're located. Okay, when your summer vegetables are finished, it's time to plant your fall cover crop. And the timing is going to vary depending on your location. But here in Napa Valley, it's usually in October. The crop will renew and replenish the soil of the good food that your vegetables may have taken out of it. Planting in the fall will allow the seeds to germinate and start growing before the cold sets in. And that's important. You don't want them to get frostbite and then they won't grow. So you want to get those things going before that real cold comes. Now, we encourage a second cover crop. Okay, so after you put in your winter vegetables and they're finished growing and you're eating them, we want you to put in a second cover crop. And again, this is going to depend on your weather and your specific garden location, but in Napa Valley, it's around February. This second cover crop will replenish the soil again, and the timing will allow it to grow before cutting it down to plant your summer garden in late April or May. Now, in general, and this is important to read about your seeds, cover crops take approximately 2 to 3 months to grow from seed stage all the way to when they start flowering. Now, when they're flowering, you want to cut those down because you don't want them to go to seed and just start growing again. You want to cut it down and leave it on your soil and leave those roots in the ground. And Carol's going to talk about those, how important those roots are later. You want to chop up that plant material that you've left on the surface into small pieces and let it sit there. And this becomes a green mulch, which will feed your soil as it decomposes and adds to the organic soil matter. And you can plant right into that stuff. You don't have to, you don't want to rake it away. You can plant your next crops right into it. Cover crops, and okay, I think I mentioned that. That ground is important to keep covered and stay cool, and it will conserve water. Think about the forest photo we saw earlier. There were trees, deep-rooted wooded plants, there were perennials. Cover crops also will pull that abundant amount of carbon from the atmosphere and sequester it deep into the ground while reducing climate change. So you can be part of that very healthful system. Next slide, please. Now this is a Napa Master Gardener's garden. And this is her vegetable garden, but she's taken out her vegetables, or she's already eating them. And she has planted vetch as one of her cover crops. And that's the very tall green crop on the left behind the little fence there, and also in that blue container on the right.
Lori, it's actually fava beans.
Oh, I'm sorry, fava beans. Thank you, Carol. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself. Fava beans. And these are essential because they put nitrogen deep in the soil. She planted these after her vegetables were done, and it will keep the soil active, and the soil organisms will stick around to keep doing their proper work in this organic matter and bringing nutrients to the plants underground. One of the most common methods, unfortunately, in agricultural farming is leaving the soil bare or fallow. I'm sure you've seen that along the roadsides. But think about it. Where in nature does that happen? Nature likes to keep its ground covered. And every time we leave the soil bare, we are losing the opportunity to pull the carbon out of the atmosphere into the soil via photosynthesis through the plants, and thus cutting off that valuable food supply, the sugars that feed the organisms underground. And we want to keep that soil system functioning. So when the soil is naked, it's also susceptible to major weather and wind erosion. And that's not good. Next slide, please. Here, keep the soil covered. Look at this beautiful way. We've got plants growing, a variety of plants, from larger bushes in the back, smaller ones, and then we've used at least 3 inches of mulch on the top. So that way, we're going to help that carbon cycle perform very efficiently. Now I'm going to turn this over to Carol, and she's going to talk about the other garden tips we want to share with you tonight. Carol?
Thank you, Lori.
Mm-hmm.
Next slide. I'm going to be talking about maximizing living roots for our next tip. Next slide. I love this photo. It shows the importance of the roots. We pay attention to what's above the ground and look what we see, just this tiny little plant. But there is a vast secret and magical world under the ground that runs the whole show. Maximizing roots means keeping plants growing in the ground as much of the time as possible. Every time we leave the soil bare, and Lori just talked about this, we're losing the opportunity to pull carbon in. We want to keep that soil functioning, and the roots of the plants are the delivery system. The tips of roots also penetrate through the pores in the soil as they grow. Lori talked a little bit about the porous nature of the soil, 25% air, 25% water. And there are spaces in the soil that allow the roots to go down, and they penetrate those pores and aerate the soil, making pathways for water to move deeper down into the soil where it will stay. Living roots in the soil build soil structure and anchor the soil in place. Naked, unstructured soil without living roots is vulnerable to wind and rain erosion, but we'll talk about erosion later. Next slide. This garden is covered with plants, and I always think about, when I see a photo like this, what the root system looks like underneath and the effect that it's having in this garden, growing all these plants. Plant lots of trees and any kind of plant. Even weeds will do it. Imagine how much carbon this garden is bringing down into the soil through photosynthesis, feeding the soil community, keeping the soil vibrantly alive and working. It's like a factory of billions of soil organisms working on our behalf, and we are completely oblivious to it. And we can't afford to be oblivious to this phenomenon any longer. It can be our lifeline to the future. Next slide. We're on to our next tip, increase plant diversity. Next slide. This is diversity the way nature does it. Take your cues from nature. In this photo, we see lots of diverse plants that are ideal for our local climate. And that means lots of roots in the ground. Think about your yards and gardens. Do you have a lot of different, a variety of plants growing? Diversity above the ground means diversity below the ground. A diversity of soil organisms will be attracted to a garden with lots of variety, bringing their many talents and soil nutrients to your plants. Next slide. Here's a Napa garden that mimics nature. It's creating, you can see the variety above the ground, and it attracts a variety of organisms for that reason. And when you have a variety of organisms, different organisms mine the minerals out of the soil, different minerals out of the soil. So they're bringing nutrients and micronutrients to the plants that many times they don't get if we use chemical fertilizers. A diversity of root improves the soil structure at the different levels in the ground and pulls carbon down. The ground underneath is covered, protected, and cool. Next slide. This is Lori's perennial garden. Look at the color in it. If we plant annuals, they need to be replanted every season. Planting perennials are the better choice. Their roots stay in the ground for year after year, feeding the soil organisms and giving us color every year. Next slide. We can also have diversity in a vegetable garden, but it looks different than in perhaps our gardens that are planted with plants that stay in there for years. Because we plant annuals in vegetable gardens, there are some unique considerations for diversity. Increasing diversity looks a little different. It's important to make sure that we rotate plant families in our vegetable gardens. We have to, every year for 3 years, sort of a 3-year rotation, we need to move the plants and then they can come back on that 4th year. If we don't, pathogens in the soil and pests above the ground and below the ground, particularly drawn to that plant family, can become a problem. By diversifying what we grow and where we grow it, we outsmart the pest community by changing what we have to offer them in our gardens, rather than relying on chemicals to do that job. This is a picture of 3 gardens that have been interplanted with a variety of different kinds of leafy greens, it looks like. This is a method that people use for small gardens, and it keeps the ground covered. It enhances soil fertility through biology and promotes cooperation between different species to enhance the health of all. And then Lori talked about cover cropping between growing seasons brings diversity, particularly to a garden bed. That's where you probably put cover crops more than you would in your landscape. Next slide. Minimize soil disturbance is our next tip. We humans are dependent upon this thin layer of topsoil covering our Earth's farmable land. Let's move to the next slide. It's that 8 to 12 inches where the life of the soil resides and determines our existence on this planet. Healthy topsoil is full of worms, bacteria, fungi, roots, and all kinds of life. And it stays put. Soil that has been plowed for years becomes powder, brown dust. It's dead. There are no worms, no life in it. Next slide. This is Ray Archuleta. He's a USDA, I think he's retired now, but he was a USDA soil scientist who was passionate about regenerative gardening. And he's going to teach us a little bit about soil aggregation.
I have a question to ask you. Is your soil healthy, functioning, and stable? One of the best diagnostic tools that I know of is the soil stability test. Here are 2 soils, exactly the same soil type. This soil has been tilled for 30 years. It is addicted to chemicals and fertilizer. This soil has not been tilled for 40 years. It is covered year-round with diverse plants. It is completely weaned from chemicals and fertilizer. Watch what happens when we drop the soil in the water. Notice how the conventional till soil is falling apart. The biotic glues in the organic matter are burned up by tillage. The soil pores have collapsed. Notice the no-till soil. The soil's holding together. The pore spaces are still intact. Do this test for yourself. I guarantee if you dig a little, you'll learn a lot.
He's quite a showman. Next slide.
I have a question to ask you. Is your soil...
This is what we don't want to see in our fields and gardens: erosion. Healthy texture of soil is a bit granular from aggregation, minerals, particles, dead organisms, and plant roots glued together by our soil organism, as Ray was talking about, that resist breaking down from external sources like wind and rain and air. Remember the Dust Bowl. These aggregates make our soil stable, preventing loss of topsoil, and create pore space that allows water to enter and move into the soil, minimizing runoff and thus erosion. In agriculture, there are estimates that we are now losing about 1% of our topsoil every year to erosion, 10 times faster than the time it takes to be rebuilt. Next slide. Remember when we were told to double dig our gardens and our garden beds and rototill our soil till it was fine and loose. Imagine what these blades slicing through that soil are doing to the critters that are hard at work in the soil and the communities that they've formed and those aggregates. Many large-scale regenerative farmers are finding that by growing plants year-round in their soils, by using cover crops, they can avoid tilling their soils, and their workload and fossil fuel use is greatly reduced. In the home garden, we can use a pitchfork to gently loosen and aerate the soil if we need to. Remember, no digging ever, but especially in wet soil, which, it compacts the soil and it crushes those pore spaces. And a little bonus tip, avoid walking on your garden beds anytime. Set out boards to step on if you need to. So I hope you understand that really this is an old-fashioned method, rototilling, and we want to make sure that we no longer are tilling our beds like this anymore. We want to have that soil stay together. Next slide. Think of a soil in a forest, only tilled by the soil community and the roots of the plants. Next slide. Practice judicious water use. Next slide. As we know with climate change, our water supplies become a very important concern to us. Water will become even more so as the world's population increases and if drought continues. Many of these water-saving methods in this section are not difficult to install. You are all familiar, I'm sure, with a drip irrigation system. And in a vegetable garden, it's best, we find, if it's laid out in a grid that can keep all the soil evenly moist. And notice the straw that's covering the ground. That's keeping the moisture in. In your landscape, to minimize water use and not waste a drop, you want to plant in hydrozones, and that works best when you do it when you're first planting your landscape plants, not afterwards. You have to think about it when you put in your system, because what you want is to have plants that have the same water needs clustered together. So you can be on the same irrigation zone or station. Remember that mature root systems extend beyond the plant's base. So as your plants grow and mature, their root systems are also growing well outside that first immediate area right around the plant. So keep moving those hoses or those lines out away from the center of the plant. Also, the soil organisms need a little moisture. They go dormant in very dry, hot soil. Next slide. These are rain barrels, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen them. Maybe those of you who are on the East Coast and are watching this maybe don't use them or don't need them. You get rain in the summer. We don't get rain in the summer. And we collect our water off the roof, and it just comes down and fills up these barrels. So it's a really good way to have winter water available to you in the summer. Next slide. Swales. Swales provide a place for water to gather and slowly permeate, returning it to the soil rather than running down the street. And they can also add beauty to your landscape. Next slide. The right plant in the right place. By using the right plants for our ecosystem, we save water. Many natives and plants suited to a dry summer ecosystem, called a Mediterranean ecosystem, don't require much water during the summer and receive their water fix in the winter when we usually get our rain. Next slide. We're on to our next tip. Garden with compost, not chemicals. After World War II, scientists discovered that they could use the excess nitrogen from munitions factories for fertilizer. Before long, it was being widely used by farmers all over the world, and thus the Green Revolution. Harvests became abundant for a while. The soil was being depleted of its soil community and its carbon organic matter. More and more synthetic nitrogen was added to the crops to try and recreate the explosion of growth that they first experienced in their farms. Homeowners and gardeners began buying this miracle for their home gardens in the 50s and 60s. Global fertilizer use rose above 200 million tons in 2018, 25% higher than recorded 10 years before. Not only do synthetic fertilizers add greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, but the production and its transport around the world also contributes. So we have a little audience participation poll again. Here's a photo of three different plants, but they are the same species. So they're all tomato plants and they're all 100 days old and they are all planted together, but they are planted in different soil that's been treated in different ways. So one of these tomato plants is planted in soil au natural, so nothing has been added. One of the plants has had compost added to it. And one of these plants has had synthetic fertilizer added to it. So what we want you to do is take a poll and guess which one. We'll need our next, why don't we?
Carol, does the next slide have the letters on it?
It does.
Okay, so let me go. Oh, there it is.
Oh, yeah, and then we'll do the next one after that and we'll have the letters on it.
Okay.
And you'll put the letters
There
in.
we go.
There we go. Perfect. So just decide which one you think has been fertilized with chemical fertilizer.
Roots. I think we have a very smart audience today.
Good.
Okay, looks like almost everybody's voted. Anybody else? Another second or two here. Okay, looks like everyone's voted, so I'm going to put up the results.
Okay. All right. So for A, we have 64%, B 22, and C 14. Well, let's find out what the real answer is, okay? And I have to congratulate you. You guys did a great job.
Bravo.
Photo A on the left shows the least well-formed root system. Giving synthetic nitrogen, which is what was fed this one, to your plants means that the natural system that builds both healthy plants and healthy soil community is short-circuited, and the plants and the organisms suffer for it. If the exchange system is disrupted between the microbes and the plant roots, the plant becomes increasingly dependent on chemicals. The only way the plant can get nutrients is from the application of more synthetic fertilizer. Photo B was a plant that was planted in the au natural soil. It probably had a little bit of organic matter in there, and it's got a little better growth than the synthetic fertilizer. And then we look at the compost and it's looks pretty great. Those are the roots I want in my garden. And increasing soil organic matter with compost and composted manure contributes to all levels of the exchange system. If your soil is missing a certain element, use organic products. Which roots do you want in your garden? A little tip about climate change and fertilizer. In a multi-decade field experiment done by the Rodale Institute comparing soil carbon sequestration and fertilization, organic fertilization significantly improved the capacity of soil organic carbon storage in comparison with chemical fertilizer. Next slide. We need to try and avoid using pesticides and herbicides and fungicides. And when you observe a pest problem, like this person is probably observing who has the garden on the left, or suspect a plant disease, instead of reaching for a chemical, call your local master gardeners with your problem. We'll help you practice something called IPM, which is Integrated Pest Management, a graduated system to address pest issues with the least invasive approach first. By the way, what we're seeing here looks like powdery mildew on the left, and this is the same plant. It looks like on both of them. Not the same plant, but the same type of plant. And it's an easy fix. And I think often what people would do is freak out and run to the store and buy their bottle of chemical, trying to figure out what to spray on this. But really what you can do is just take a pair of clippers and cut some of those leaves off. Or perhaps it was raining, or perhaps you're sprinkling this plant and it wasn't drying out during the day. It was late in the day when it was watered. So powdery mildew, a quick fix. So 47, let's move to the next slide. Thank you. The research tells us that natural approaches are not only better for the climate, but also for our gardens. Next slide. Reduce energy use. This is our last tip. Next slide. Keep in mind as we think about energy that we want to reduce fossil fuel use. Use electric rechargeable battery powered equipment instead of gas. And hand tools are even better and healthier for the gardener. And even better, take a seat on your garden lounge chair and enjoy your garden for the afternoon. Watch the wildlife in this life supportive space that you have created. A little wild, a lot natural, and maybe some areas even untended this season. Next slide. So here we have the 8 tips again listed. Increase soil organic matter, keep soil covered, maximize living roots, increase plant diversity, minimize soil disturbance, practice judicious water use, garden with compost, not chemicals, and reduce energy use. It takes time to build the soil community in your garden. Just keep adding compost. Keep those roots growing, and that soil biome will be happy. It requires a leap of faith for gardeners to drop the chemicals and stop their rototilling. But your plants and the earth will thank you for it. And now back to Lori.
Okay, so now we only have a few minutes left. We had lots to share with you tonight. So we're going to invite Matt Navarro to please unmute yourself. And are there some questions that you found in the chat that maybe we could answer over the next few minutes? Any questions?
Looks like there was lots of questions in the chat. So let's see.
Oh, Matt can't be unmuted. He needs to be unmuted, I guess.
Oh dear. Let's see. I can see a few of these here. Somebody's asking for a good source of commercial compost. I would say that both of our waste management companies have great compost. Both the North Compost folks and the South in America Canyon. Either one of those are great sources. Let me see what else is here. Let's see. Oh, there's lots of great comments in here.
So
Um,
can you hear me now?
Oh,
Yes.
yes, there you go.
One question that came up, and both of you might have your own answer for it. How would you recommend making compost in your own yard? What are the methods you're using and what works best?
Well, I'm a composter, and I started composting successfully during COVID. We've always sort of had a slow compost pile, a cool one that I didn't worry about getting, my husband and I didn't worry about getting hot. But hot compost is kind of fun because you get that feedback of what's happening. What you want to do is have 3 times the carbon to 1 part green. So that's by volume. And so it's 3 parts carbon, so brown, and 1 part green, and you layer them. Sometimes what I'll do is buy alfalfa pellets at the farm store and sprinkle those in. I go to the coffee store and put in coffee grounds. And we have a great composting workshop. Isn't it coming up?
Our very next library talk is going to be all about making hot compost. So I would recommend you join us next month, the first Thursday, and you'll learn all about compost.
Okay. Another question, Matt? I see one here that asks for example of cover crops. I hope that maybe you caught some of that vetch, daikon radish, various types of clovers, fava beans. Oh my gosh, there is such a buckwheat.
Grasses, ryegrass is another one that's really deep, broad.
There are some really great cover crop mixes. There's a lot of information right now on cover crops, and it depends what you want to do with the crop. Grasses and some of the things that have netting roots are very good for holding soil, and some of the legumes will add a lot of nutrients. So you kind of have to think about what you want to do with your soil and what direction you want it to go, whether you need nutrients or you're just trying to hold the soil in place.
And also what you grew before and what you're planning on growing. As you know, I know that farmers change their mixes every time they put in their cover crops because they're looking at their soil and knowing what they've planted and what they're planting next.
There's a great question here about planting a garden in clay soil and how to get the ground ready. I think some layer mulching might be a really good method to help improve clay soil, is to layer mulch using compost and cardboard. It takes time, but it works really well to help let the worms do the work for you if you do the layer mulching.
And also I would say grasses would be a good cover crop to look at because they do have roots that go down deep and they're broad and they work their way into the soil. Daikon radish is another one that will drill down.
I saw a comment in the questions about roots of weeds, what to do about roots of weeds if you're not digging the soil. And I know Matt did some demonstrations on using hula hoe out at our Lost Florist Learning Garden. So Matt, do you want to answer that one?
Can you repeat the question one more time? I was
the roots of weeds. If you're not digging them up out of your soil, what happens to those roots?
So those roots are going to, if the weed is really hardy, the roots are going to send up a new shoot because the weed is trying to survive and get a hold in your garden. It's not necessarily a bad thing. As gardeners, we have to accept that there will be some amount of weeds in our yard. That's essentially unavoidable. But hacking them down before they go to seed makes them appear less frequently. So those roots are going to send up new leaves and shoots, which you can hack down again, or the roots will die and they'll feed the soil. To go along with the idea of cover cropping, adding a cover crop will provide more competition for weeds in your garden. And again, while you will never eliminate weeds, if you are purposefully planting one type of plant that you call a cover crop, it is going to make it harder for weeds. There's more competition for sunlight, competition for water and nutrients, and it will make them weaker overall in your yard.
I see a few more questions, but I'm conscious of our time. And so I would like to, we can answer some more of those questions if people want to hang on for a few more minutes, but I would like to just go through the next couple of slides, which shows our resources, if that's okay with our guest speakers.
Yes, please. Well, and if you send in your questions to our help desk, I think that you'll get a lot of information there too. I'm sorry we don't have time to answer everything tonight. But we do hope that we have moved you to action tonight to try going natural in the way you treat your soil and help sequester carbon and helping to reduce climate change. These are a group of resources that we use tonight, the references that we use tonight for our presentation, and even more than what we could even fit on this page. But we will be posting these on our website along with other resources. Now, this presentation tonight was recorded and it will be on the Napa County Master Gardener website. And you will go to our homepage there, napamg.ucanr.edu, and you will see this menu bar and click on events, find us. And then that second part down at the bottom will drop down and you'll see references and slides. They're circled in red. Click there. You will not only see tonight's presentation in a few days, but you will see a host of other very informative presentations that have been made in the past here at Napa in our Master Gardener program.
And we will also post the reference page as a separate page, so you'll have live links you could click on to get to those resources.
Right. Next slide, please. We just want to tell you about some exciting things coming up. The second Sunday of every month, we have a food growing forum, and we have one on February 14th on seed starting, and on March 14th on fertilizers and soil health. So they're going to go more in depth on some of the things that we talked about tonight. And the next slide on the left, there's the home composting that Yvonne mentioned. It's a library talk on March 4th. And then on the right, we would love to have you come back and join us on April 17th in the morning. We are going to do, the basis of this talk tonight will be the basis of that 2-hour workshop, but we're going to drill in deeper into some of the topics. We're going to have some additional Master Gardeners joining us. And we're going to do some breakouts, some interaction with our attendees. We want you to really have a chance to talk, ask questions, share your knowledge with us. So please come back for a refresher course and to participate with us on April 17th. And the next one is, there we are. Please explore our website and the library as well, a wealth of information. And we thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much. And if you did type questions into the chat and you gave us your email, I will try to answer some of those, and we will definitely get back to you. So if you have any further questions, do chat them in, and I will record the chat. So we'll have all those questions. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to our hosts from the Napa Library, and we will see you hopefully next month. Bye-bye, everybody.